Hi, I'm Claire Coady. I'm a freelance planner. A couple of years ago, I did the IPA Excellence Diploma, a course I highly recommend to anyone who wants to do it. As part of that, for my final piece, I should say, I interviewed quite a few political consultants and campaign workers, including talking to a number of current and former strategists about what they do. What I compiled that into is a series of things that agencies can learn from political campaigns. At the time, this was 2017, 2018, I believe. It not only it wasn't that it was particularly topical for me. It was that it felt like we were looking at campaigns and trying to derive lessons, and it felt like there was more that they could teach agencies because there was more overlap. And so that's what I did. And I'm going to tell you now about some of my observations. Before I carry on, I want to say two thank yous. The first is to Giles Edwards for arranging isolated talks. I think this is a phenomenal program. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm really, really excited to be participating. The second is a thank you to the campaign workers and political consultants who spoke to me in confidence when I originally put together the essay. Without their generosity of time and also their candor, this essay just wouldn't have been possible, really. So I'm really, really grateful to them for doing that. Before we move on as well, one thing I will mention is that this talk is about the mechanics of political campaigns. It is not a talk about politics. I will be commenting on politics, although I will be using examples from across the political spectrum. This will be done in a pretty neutral way. So when I started interviewing the consultants and campaign workers, the very first thing they asked me is, well, what do we really have in common? And I think this is a question that also comes out from people who work in advertising. What do we really have in common with political campaigns? They work on something that has a very short time frame, with a win or lose outcome, whereas we're building brands for life, or not just life, maybe for surviving hundreds of years. And while that's true, I think we do share challenges, and particularly challenges of complexity and constraint. And while we have managed these overlapping challenges for 50 or maybe 100 years at most, this is something that political campaigns and politicians have been managing for hundreds of years. I think particularly for them, complexity is not the history of complexity, it's just history. And even some of the challenges we face in complexity are very, very similar. So for example, one of the things we talk about in complexity is how media channels proliferate. This is something that political campaigns have been dealing with, not just as long as we have, but far, far longer. They've also dealt with, it should go without saying, demographic complexity, political complexity, and all the things that come with that. It is just part of the job, and it's something they live for. The second is constraint. Now, when we talk about constraints, we talk about budgetary constraint, we talk about legal constraint, and we talk about time constraint. And these three things are all things that political campaigns have managed since political campaigns started, with increasing focus on, particularly I think the budgetary and the legal constraint aspect of it. The time is always something they've had to manage. And I think there is something that we can learn from them in that respect. Chiefly the way that they manage this is through behavior. So there's two behaviors that I think that I'll go on to talk about, that I think are particularly relevant to advertising as well as politics. But they also manage it through how they structure campaigns in their teams. And in the course of my research, I found that there were 5 campaigns that we can learn from. So first I'll talk about the behaviors, and then I'll talk about the structure of the campaigns and their teams that we can potentially look at adopting for ourselves. Political campaigns manage these challenges with behavioral quirks and structural solutions. First, the behavioral quirks. And the very first behavioral quirk is paranoia. And I'm going to give you an example of a scenario from an interview I did with one of the political campaigners. I asked him point blank, do you think you're paranoid? And he said, no, of course I don't. I'm not paranoid. And then as we were talking, I said, well, do you hire private investigators to do research on your own candidate? And he just looked at me and said, well, how else do you anticipate threats? And I think that level of paranoia is something we don't appreciate and don't get in advertising. I think we talk about a good game about the competition or trying to beat them out or getting one up over someone. We don't mean it the same way. It isn't as tough, and it probably shouldn't be as well. I mean, people sometimes say it's just advertising, and to a degree that's right. But that level of paranoia feeds some behaviors that I think would be useful for us. You know, when we look at campaigns that aren't as effective, or we're not able to take those bold steps or severe steps that sometimes we need to take with our brands, part of it, I think, is we're in denial about how serious the situation is. And the reason we're in denial about that is because we don't know. We don't want to be too negative, so we don't do the self-research that we need to do, really interrogate our weaknesses the same way a political campaign would, you know, doing opposition and self-research. I think that's really important. And they don't just do this during campaigns as well. Although the number of staff might change, you know, you might have much more staff on a campaign, or the number of data sources might change, or the quality or expensive data sources might change. Overall, you are talking about a group of people who might shrink down but are always focused on this to some degree. There might only be 3 of them operating 2 years out, but, you know, they're doing it. And I think that's something we miss, you know, especially looking at an era now where we do a lot of project-based work and we have a definitive start point and an end point to a project. Whatever happens outside of that, because it isn't billable, we're not allowed to record it or even look into it. And I think we end up losing some of our credibility as agencies and as real partners for our clients. The second quirk is opportunism. Now, at least one person has said to me, but we are opportunistic. How is this new? And I think the reality is we talk a good game about opportunism, but it takes on another dimension in political campaigns with the influence of intrigue. It affects the language of campaigns, but it also makes them more focused as well. We do share some of this language, of course, but it did make me laugh when I was talking to one of the former consultants, and he said to me, look, we used to call it a war room because it's a fucking war. That really struck me because, of course, we have the same thing in advertising. We do have war rooms, especially if you're on new business pitches, but we in no way mean it to the same degree as a political campaign would. They're very focused on it. And what it does make them do is look for opportunities wherever they can find them. It affects the way that they approach everything. I mean, just to take one example, it affects the way that they approach media. They're much more flexible about their view of it. And again, this is something we talk a really good game about. You know, we talk about, we should be much more creative with media. Look at this example, look at that example. We gave this a lion. But political campaigns do this day in and day out. If you're running a campaign, you're looking at everything as media. And that's not something we really do because, you know, it's not part of our business model. The other side of this, of course, is the need to be reactive. Again, this is something we talk a very good game about, but we overcomplicate it, largely because we put some charts in place and then hope that's the end of it. Political campaigns are just reactive because they are aware of their own weaknesses, super aware. This goes back to the paranoia point. You know, if you're aware of those weaknesses, you can then plan for them and mitigate them. And I feel like that's something that we miss. And then it blindsides us when someone points out that something's wrong with the brand we're working on, or the product, or there's a recall, or because nobody's anticipated it. Nobody's thought ahead to what would happen and thought about turning that into an opportunity. More than one person that I interviewed brought up a quote that's been attributed to Rahm Emanuel, but I'm absolutely certain was said by someone else far earlier. Never let a good crisis go to waste. This seems to be, I don't know, like the first commandment of 2 commandments maybe that political campaigns have. And I think it's something that we sometimes use in advertising as well, or jokingly say as well, even if it sounds a bit crass right now. But we don't tend to do that very often, or there's very few examples of brands that have done that well. I mean, all of you are going to simultaneously think KFC, but I challenge you to think of another 5 and really because crises happen to brands all the time, there should be more examples. There should be more examples of brands who've taken that and turned it around, not least by showing a bit of transparency or honesty in what they do. I think right now we're seeing a little bit more of that, but we're also seeing lots of brands who look woefully underprepared because they didn't take the time to anticipate their own weaknesses, and they didn't take the time to plan accordingly, or at the very least, start addressing them, which is what a political campaign would do. The sense that they have to do that flows into the way that they structure their teams for political campaigns, and also the way that they then structure their organization. And I think that's the lesson that we as agencies can take most. So that's what I'm going to come on to next is, okay, now that we know this, how do we then operate as agencies? How do we structure our teams? Are there things that we're already doing or not? First, the core team. When we think of core team, we probably think of the core group of people who run an account and do it for several years. The core team in politics, by my definition, are the people who've been with the candidate or have been with the political campaign from its very beginnings. And I'm talking like 5-10 years before we kick off. This is Philip Gould and Alistair Campbell for Tony Blair. This is David Plouffe and David Axelrod for Obama. They were with these candidates for 5 years or more before the campaign even got started. These are people who are about steering the strategic direction of this brand, of this campaign from, over a much longer period of time. Whether you are an election campaign or whether you are in off mode, they are always there, and they're there for the duration. A similar type of team, but different, is the coalition team. And this is a group of people who are brought together for a certain cause or for a slightly shorter period of time. They have the same functionality as a core team, but they're less, it's temporary in nature. The core team or the coalition team is often augmented in an election campaign by specialists. In advertising, when we think specialists, we think of people performing a particular job or a particular task, the silos. In political campaigns, often when I refer to specialists, what I'm referring to is people who are brought in just to do the political campaign, and they can provide a number of functions. A corollary in advertising would be bringing in extra account people to handle a particularly big brand campaign, for example. Or in politics, this can include pollsters, or it can include specialist campaign staff. The fourth team is a team I refer to as the crack team. The most famous example of this is probably Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway being brought in at the last minute, or as last minute as you can get in American politics, to really shake up the Trump campaign in 2016 and to change its course, which I think, like it or loathe it, they did pretty successfully. They aren't often likable people or background people. They're people who are designed to really cause a disturbance, for want of a better word. And when they do it, it can be highly effective. In advertising, we talk about this a lot. I do see a lot of briefs to hire strategists that are meant to effectively shake things up or do things a little differently. We talk about bringing in disruptive forces. I don't think we necessarily do this as well, probably because we don't give them the remit to do. For one thing, I think, when a political campaign does it, the political campaign does it for a short duration. And often when you see these people come into office, maybe the exception here is Dominic Cummings, they don't last particularly long because they're not, indoor cats. They're people whose job is to be a disruptive force, and maybe there's something about them wanting to shake that up. The other thing is we tend to try to bring in specialists to do that, or augment a team with specialists who can get that job done. So that's not the same as effectively replacing the core team, which is often what the crack team does. In some cases they do augment it, but I haven't seen an example where that lasts a particularly long time. Usually they are brought in to completely overhaul it, as in the Steve Bannon case. it's a risky gamble. You know, this is what you do when you have absolutely nothing to lose. But you know, it's done in concert with the chief stakeholders in that campaign, maybe a chief donor or the candidate themselves. But it can be really, really, really successful. I think in advertising, this is where we're most lacking, or maybe even least tolerant of these sorts of people. Actually, that might be a society as a whole thing, because where's Steve Bannon today? He's not exactly wandering the halls of the White House, or indeed in politics itself. But Kellyanne Conway is pretty successful, and arguably so is Dominic Cummings, and he is one of those crack team people. So how do we then all put this together as an agency when we're working on a project or working on a brand? How do we structure that team, or how does this really have an impact? And for me, I found there were 5 things, or 5 types of teams and campaigns that we could really learn from. So first, the game changer. I think if you were to ask anyone in advertising, any clients, anyone really, what kind of campaign they want to work on, I think they'd say that this is the one they're most excited by. This is the one they want to most be like, because it's about introducing a new brand with a bang, and that applies to politics as well. You know, the game changer campaign, the ultimate version of this, is probably Barack Obama's 2008 election campaign. You know, that's the one that really sticks in our mind. And the team that works behind this tends to be the core team. They're there from the beginning. They're a team that's been nurturing the candidate, the brand, from the beginning. And they may have been at this a really long time. You know, as I said, 5 years, 10 years, you know, maybe slightly less, but sometimes even longer. They might have been with them from, you know, 15 years before they had to go. Of this nature, you know, this serious. And it's pretty exciting, but there are potentially things that can disrupt its momentum. I think the key threat here is the dominance of the current leadership. They can still turn that around. They can still make a dent. I think oftentimes when these sorts of game changer campaigns are really successful is when there's a bit of a vacuum. So if you think back to Obama's 2008 campaign, the thing that probably helped him most as well is the fact that, you know, he wasn't running against an incumbent. I mean, John McCain was a maverick in theory, and Obama just usurped all that. The second problem that you often come across is potentially shifting to rational messages too soon. And you see this a lot in political campaigns. You know, you have a political brand or political party, and they're getting some momentum. They're getting, you know, they want to be the force for change. Let's think of Labour in the last election. But although their intention was to be the game changer, they shifted so quickly to rational messages and focused so much on the policy that people just got lost. They're just not as engaged with it. The game changer campaigns are so much about the emotional momentum, and for that, you really need is that team steering it who understand the emotional heart of that campaign. And they get augmented by specialists as campaigns ramp up, as they build, as they're needed. And the ones that are particularly important are you know, in political campaigns will be pollsters. I think in advertising, the specialists that you tend to need most are people who specialize in particular channels potentially, or even particular kinds of strategists, or have people with different kinds of experience to act as, you know, consultative voices. It's incredibly helpful, and political campaigns use these as well, and they do this really well. The second campaign type that you have that we could really use, I think, is the cause celeb, and this is challenger, but with a little bit of a twist. In my mind, these are some of the more populist campaigns you've seen in the last couple of years. They best represent this, and they often choose one issue and just narrow down the focus on that and build and build and build and create momentum. And the teams that often wrap around this are not core teams, but coalition teams augmented by specialists. So if you think of UKIP and its rise to power, UKIP, you know, although a political party, it wasn't it wasn't a party that came from nowhere. It was a party that drew people from different parts of the political spectrum, some of them not even involved, and just attracted people who had that laser focus, commitment to a single cause, like it or loathe it. That's the Cause Celeb campaign. And the key threat to its momentum could be itself. I mean, if it pushes it too far, or if it becomes too niche, too wrapped up in its own focus, it ends up losing its credibility. We saw that in the Brexit campaign itself. In theory, UKIP should have been leading this charge, and we've had pretty entertaining television shows, I'd say, as well. That comment on this, the fact that when it came down to the campaign, they ended up usurping them with a crack team, because otherwise they were just going to look like a bunch of Looney Tunes. And I think that's potentially one of the risk factors here. Conversely, the other potential problem that the CÉLèbre faces is that the game changer adopts their message, or adopts their key cause, or even the leader itself. If we think about Brexit in particular, and we think about UKIP, one of the threats to its existence is the fact that Brexit happened. And it happened because the Conservative Party adopted it as its policy. So where do people go? They go back to the leader, and that's always something that's a particular threat to momentum. It's not necessarily to say that it could potentially end it, but it's there. And although it probably makes us a little bit uncomfortable to think about what we do in the same light as a campaign run for the likes of UKIP, I think it is salient to point out that they are the part of the political spectrum, or the part of political campaigning that has really adopted challenger mentality, something that we desperately want and desperately want to be. So there are still lessons that we can draw from that. I mean, particularly how focused they are on the single issue or message when they need to be. The question, of course, is always what happens when you need to evolve that, or when you get bigger than that. What should UKIP have done once Brexit was finalized? That's the open question, because otherwise you die. That's it. The next type of campaign is the new kid on the block, and the main purpose of this campaign is really to use its rapidly growing awareness, often exponentially growing awareness, to increase its penetration or share of the market. These are incredibly, incredibly rare, but they are possible. And the way that they become possible is by taking what is really niche appeal or a small segment and turning it into mass appeal through the opportunities you have in front of you. One example of this is Emmanuel Macron's rise to the French presidency in 2017. But it's not a particularly helpful example, because it's a brand new party that went from nothing, literally nothing, to the highest echelons of office. And it's so rare that it's hard to derive useful examples. But the other one is the SNP and their rise to effectively become the third party in Parliament in 2014-2015 after the Scottish referendum. It's also very rare, and it's very, very delicate still, but it is a good example for us to look at. I think what's particularly interesting is that they not only have core teams that work on these brands in politics, as with Emmanuel Macron. It's actually, when these are most successful, it's actually often a coalition that coalesces together into a core team. These aren't necessarily people who work together forever and ever, although there might be, person A and person B who've known each other for a long time or worked in different parts, because they can come from lots of different parts of the political spectrum, or even from outside of politics. You often get different types of teams and different types of people coming together, and they again get augmented by specialists as they need it or as that appeal builds. The main thing is their commitment to it, is their focus on developing it, and being acutely aware of how sensitive this type of campaign is, and this type of political campaign. I mean, there's really one key threat to momentum here, and that is not assessing your own weaknesses. It has to be said again and again, and it actually came up in my conversations with the political strategists, that why aren't there more of these types of campaigns or successful examples of them? And they said because they die very quickly because their weaknesses get exposed. And often those weaknesses are exactly what you think they are. The weakness is inexperience, so you don't assess your own weaknesses because you're inexperienced. The really successful ones are those that are honestly able to assess their weaknesses and mitigate them for example, the SNP, they had two glaring weaknesses that could have sunk them. The first was a weakness in leadership. And although Alex Salmond was a very popular, charismatic, and quite remarkable leader for the SNP, particularly in the early part of its life, I think towards the end it became a bit of a burden because its fortunes were so tied up in the fortunes of its leader. And when he resigned at the end of the Scottish referendum in 2014, that really could have been the death of the SNP, but for the strong leadership of Nicola Sturgeon, who succeeded him. And she did a lot to address the second glaring weakness they had, which is that they were regarded in Westminster and I think among the wider electorate, particularly in general elections, as somewhat of a niche party that had one purpose, which was really to fight for independence, and that was seen to be dead. Nicola Sturgeon used that growing awareness and used that growing credibility to establish the SNP as a viable national political party. And that's part of the reason, a substantial part of the reason why they are the third largest party in Parliament today. So we've talked about 2 or 3 kinds of campaigns that we'd all probably like to work on, or at least the advertising guys are working on. The fourth one is probably the one that's most relevant to us, I think. And it's the one we tend to see more than most. I call this the big reappraisal. And the biggest example of this is New Labour's move from Old Labour in the mid-90s up to 1997, and the Conservatives, or the New Conservatives, and the detoxification of the Conservative brand from the time David Cameron became the leader of the party. This type of campaign is resource-heavy, and it takes a lot of effort, and it's not often guaranteed, but it can be successful, and when it works, I think it's a relief to everyone. But I think the reason I say, in advertising we see this more often is because think about the kinds of briefs that you get in and the briefs that you get day to day. Often the brands that you work on are pretty established brands. They do have some resources behind them, but they're looking at what they need to do and what they need to achieve, or particular growth targets, and thinking, how do we do this without some kind of intervention that helps people change the way they think about the brand. So that's why I think that this is most relevant. But it's not without its threats to momentum. And the biggest threat is changing the assets, but not the experience. And I think this is something that we can all relate to. We need people to reassess our brand. We need people to think more favorably. We shoved a label on the pack and there we go. Often that isn't enough, or we've made a new ad and it's all fine now. This happens so often in politics as well, where they've refreshed the campaign message, they've refreshed the logo, or the way they give speeches, they've refreshed the conference venue, but they haven't actually thought about the whole experience of the brand. Who represents this brand, who represents this party. What are the policies? Do they mean anything? You don't have to change it necessarily every policy, but understanding what people need or want is really key to that. And I think that's the biggest pitfall. And to some extent, that's why the Conservatives sometimes have struggled with it. I mean, conservative by name, conservative by nature. But it's also why any large, big brand, Labour included, struggles with this too. And this is often where you get the biggest conflict with teams. So in an ideal world, when you're running a campaign like this, you probably have a core team and specialists. But because they need to do a reappraisal, often what happens is you need to bring in a crack team to do it. You need to bring in new personnel. And for New Labour, that meant entirely new personnel. If you think about not just the politicians at the front, you think about the people at the back, Philip Gould, Alistair Campbell, these were all new people to the machine. They didn't use the press officer they've been using for 30 years. They didn't think about, keeping the same leadership behind the scenes, but just pushing new people forward. It was a root and branch review of how they do things. And that's something that I think we can sympathize with a little bit in agencies, because, we know we need to do the big reappraisal, but we're going to bring in this one person to kind of be the disruptor, and then the whole team is going to have to figure out how to work with it. And actually, if you're thinking about that, you do need to rip things up and change them again, but that can be a really painful process, and it can take a lot of energy and effort to do. And if you're only doing it on one side of the equation, i.e. the agency side, what are you left with, really? The last one is the leader lockup, and lockup might have been a little bit misleading because this is really about how you as a leader brand deal with emerging threats. And the scale of those emerging threats can be quite different. If you think about labor in 2001 and labor in 2005, the scale of the challenge they had to deal with was so much more significant in 2005 than in 2001. And it can also be about trying to retain their leadership or even just their market share in a highly fragmenting category. Think about the Conservatives in 2015 desperately trying to retain their share when they had people leaving for UKIP, not only their politicians but voters as well, abandoning them in droves. So how do you get them to stay? How do you get them to come back? And this is a very, very, very tricky thing to balance as well. But this is where you definitely start eschewing the core team, or the core team starts to take a much more backseat approach, and you bring in the crack team to handle it. You bring in new personnel to run the campaign differently, and to really assess the party and shake things up. And they are of course augmented by specialists as well, who come in to help run the campaign. It's interesting to note that the specialists might be the same kinds of specialists you had running the campaign when you were the game changer or when you were the new kid on the block. If you're a campaign strategist or a campaign manager, that's your vocation. That's what you do, and you adapt your approach as you go along. The key threats to their momentum, and I think this is something we can all appreciate, is just the failure to keep up with the innovations that are brought by game changers or by cause celebs. If you think again about the Conservatives in 2015, they were facing this, this incredible challenge from a cause celeb from UKIP. If you think about the Republicans in 2008, try as they might, even with the maverick John McCain, they just could not fend off that challenge from the game changers. It's very, very hard to do. And so that's why this is such a tricky position sometimes to be in. You might be in a position of leadership, you might have that dominance, but there is something that can turn people's heads, or there is something that can challenge your momentum. And in some cases, it's enough to cause significant problems. I think this is also a case where we deal with this on a day-to-day basis in advertising. I think more often than we get the cause celebs or the game changers that we all want to work on. These are our leader brands. These are the Tesco's and the British Airways and the Vodafones of this world, and we all know how tricky that can be. When your category is facing really significant challenge, but there is a little bit of pressure to maintain the status quo because you're worried about losing so much more. How do you do that? And that answer is bringing in crack teams. And it can be quite hard to do, but of course in concert with the right kind of specialists who can help you move the campaign along as you go. But now that we've gone through this, there's two things really to note about this crack team and core team thing. That's not to say that these might not even be the same people. So, for example, Jim Messina was Barack Obama's core team in 2012. And eventually, when that was done, he became a consultant for political campaigns. And he was then the crack team in 2015 for the New Conservatives. He advised on that campaign, as well as on others. So these people can be the same people. It's about the role you play, not the kind of person you are. The second thing to say is that it doesn't also mean, I think particularly if we think about, the leader lockup situation where you have a core team that's long existed and you need to bring in the crack team to effectively run things. It's not to say that the core team still doesn't have value. So the people who form the core team probably act in, almost like a chairman or an advisory capacity. The challenge then, of course, is how do you make sure that you're offering consultation or advice and not trying to steamroll what is effectively a new team that's trying to build this campaign. In conclusion, we know the problems we have and the challenges we face. But I think we're in denial about how our behaviors and decisions sometimes exacerbate or even add to these problems. We lionize brave and bold work, but our actions don't always reflect it. Our decisions in our organizations aren't as bold and brave or strategic as we believe ourselves to be. But this can change. If we want our brands, our campaigns, and our companies to survive the current challenges, we do need to learn from those who've been at this longer than we have. And I think we can get those lessons from people who work in politics and political campaigns, or it's at least one source of it. And we can take some comfort as well from those who work in politics, because they've been weathering challenges like this and these challenges as well for much, much longer than we have, and they've survived, and we will too. So thank you again for listening. Despite the fact that this is over 40 minutes long, it really does scrape the surface. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. You can reach me by email at hello@clairecoady.co.uk. Otherwise, thank you again for listening, and thanks again to Giles Edwards for arranging this. Bye.